Welcome to Scandalcast. In this video, I will be recapping episode 8 of Hulu's The Dropout, breaking down what was real and what the producers took a little creative license with. Did Tyler Schultz really write that letter to his grandfather? I'll answer all your questions. This episode was entitled Lizzie. In the episode, Elizabeth's new boyfriend calls her Lizzie, and she uses the name Lizzie to call an Uber. The title reflects how Elizabeth Holmes assumes a new identity in this episode, one that's less formal than the black pantsuit wearing, hair up in a bun Elizabeth identity that she had been assuming for years. At the beginning of the episode, there seems to be barely any fallout from the Wall Street Journal's bombshell story. In the episode, Elizabeth is shown on the phone frantically trying to make sure her entire board stays on her side, which they do. In real life, after the article was released, Elizabeth's board released a statement saying she still had their full support, and Channing Robertson gave an interview where he called her a genius and compared her to Mozart. Elizabeth kept attending public events as if everything was normal. She held a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. As mentioned on the show, she accepted a Woman of the Year award from Glamour magazine. At the ceremony, she was presented the award by actor Jared Leto. The book Bad Blood described it all as a charade that finally came to an end when the CMS report came out. CMS is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It's the government agency responsible for oversight of clinical laboratories, while the FDA is responsible for oversight of the diagnostic equipment that laboratories use for their testing. The real Erica Chung did send an email to the CMS about 3 weeks before the John Carreyrou article came out. It landed in the inbox of an inspector called Gary Yamamoto, who is a real person. In real life, Gary Yamamoto had actually done an inspection of Theranos about 3 years before getting that Erica Chung email. He had inspected Theranos after receiving a tip from a military officer assigned to set up a deal between Theranos and the military. The officer had become suspicious that Theranos was attempting to dodge regulatory oversight of their Theranos devices. That inspection 3 years ago was supposed to have been a surprise, but Holmes had been tipped off about it and had been prepared, so she had managed to pass the inspection. This time, Theranos didn't get any heads up. Yamamoto showed up unannounced along with one other inspector just 3 days after receiving Erica's email. Just like in the show, Theranos employees made the CMS inspectors sit through a PowerPoint presentation in an obvious delaying tactic. The two CMS inspectors found so many problems that they decided to come back in 2 months to do a more extensive investigation. By the time they came back for their second visit, the Wall Street Journal article had been released, which just increased the pressure on the CMS to do a more thorough investigation. The results of the CMS investigation were devastating. The report stated that Theranos posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. It also confirmed what the Wall Street Journal had stated about how only 12 tests were actually being done on the Edisons. Up until this point, Theranos had been accusing the Wall Street Journal of lying and had constantly called on the journal to retract its statements and threatened to sue them for defamation. After the CMS investigation, all these threats and calls for retractions finally stopped. As a result of the CMS investigation, Elizabeth Holmes was banned from running a blood testing company for 2 years. This was when Elizabeth did that famous interview portrayed in the episode, the interview where she repeatedly claimed to be devastated at discovering the state of the lab. That interview was actually conducted by Maria Shriver in real life. Random aside, it wasn't mentioned in the show, but Tyler Schultz had actually submitted a formal complaint about Theranos in April 2014, while he was still working there, and more than a year prior to Erica's complaint. He had submitted it to the New York State Department of Health using a fake name, Colin Ramirez. This Colin Ramirez was actually mentioned in John Carreyrou's original Wall Street Journal article, That was back when Tyler Schultz was still choosing to remain anonymous. The New York State Department of Health claimed they had forwarded Tyler's complaints to the CMS, but nothing had come of it. So the CMS had been alerted about Theranos at least 2 times before Erica's complaint came in, once from Tyler and another time from that army officer, but the third time was when Theranos finally faced consequences. Speaking about Tyler, the next topic is Tyler deciding to publicly disclose his identity as a whistleblower and coming clean with his grandfather about being a source for the article. According to his audiobook, his grandfather eventually figured out that he had been a source after reading the articles for himself. In his audiobook, Tyler doesn't mention anything about he and his grandfather squabbling about their family name like they do on the show, but Tyler did say something to his grandfather about wanting his grandfather to protect his legacy by ending his support of Elizabeth. Tyler really did write a letter to his grandfather that he read out loud, reportedly while choking back tears. He told his grandfather how everything he had said about Theranos had been proven true, yet his grandfather continued to disappoint him at every possible opportunity by continuing to support Elizabeth. He said he could think of only 3 possible reasons why his grandfather was still supporting Elizabeth. Either he was corrupt and willing to make ethical compromises in order to see a return on his investment in Theranos, or he had lost his mental edge, or he was in love with Elizabeth. The show left out the part where Tyler Schultz actually accused his grandfather of possibly being in love with Elizabeth Holmes. George Schultz continued to believe Elizabeth for a long time. The show kind of makes it seem like he saw the light while watching that devastating interview, which took place in April 2016, but George Schultz actually didn't leave the Theranos board until about a year after that interview. Believe it or not, the board continued to support Elizabeth for a full year and a half after the Wall Street Journal article came out. At first, they just asked Elizabeth to run some comparison tests between her device and traditional blood testing devices to prove that her devices worked, and Elizabeth agreed like it was no big deal. But then she started coming up with one excuse after another for why she didn't have the results. The board also eventually saw some financials that were different from what Elizabeth had been telling them, and some members of the board, for the very first time, finally began to accuse Elizabeth of being dishonest, and members of the board finally began to resign. George Schultz and Tyler did eventually reconcile. Although the meeting portrayed with John Carreyrou in the show didn't happen, George Schultz did release a statement to Nightline praising how Tyler navigated the Theranos situation and congratulating Tyler for his great moral character, even when Tyler believed that his grandfather had placed allegiance to Theranos over allegiance to his own family. Next up is how Elizabeth wound up firing Sonny. It needs to be emphasized that we don't know if Sonny privately contacted lawyers to shield himself, if Elizabeth held board meetings without Sonny's knowledge, or if Elizabeth secretly packed up to leave while Sonny was still at the office, or even what Elizabeth and Sonny said in their private conversations at the time he was fired, whether she gaslighted him like she did on the show. Those scenes were thoroughly gripping and chilling, but they were made up. What is true, however, is that Sonny was made to take the blame, and there is evidence that he left on terms that weren't his own. In his audiobook and in various interviews, Tyler Schultz repeatedly emphasized that while Sonny and Elizabeth were both bad people, and while he believed Sonny was running the company exactly how Elizabeth wanted him to, Elizabeth had set things up so that Sonny would be the bad guy while she preserved what Tyler Schultz called an angelic image. Not only was Sonny the one who was responsible for firing and intimidating employees, Sonny was also the one put in charge of running the labs, while Elizabeth ran the business side. So when all this scandal about the lab tests erupted in the Wall Street Journal, Elizabeth blamed Sonny, and people like George Schultz completely believed her. Although we don't know what Sunny and Elizabeth said to each other when they broke up, a lot of the things they said in their fight on the show were things they had texted to each other at some other point in a different context. Much of the conversation seems to have been inspired by a string of texts that they sent to each other in July 2015, a couple of months before the Wall Street Journal article came out. Around this time, they were still trying to squash the journal's sources, and they had just had a tense meeting with the board where they had warned the board about the upcoming article. The text implied that it seems that talk of Sunny possibly resigning had come up. In the text, Sunny says he won't leave until the company has broken even with a working product. He says that Elizabeth needed him until then, and he warned Elizabeth that the world was a mean place and that people had only been nice to them until then because of greed. Those are pretty much exactly what he says to Elizabeth during their fight in this episode. Given that Sunny was fired soon after the CMS report, which came out a few months after the Wall Street Journal article, it appears that Sunny did not leave on his own terms, so the show probably portrayed that accurately. It is also true that Sunny and Elizabeth claimed in their depositions that they stopped speaking to each other soon after he left the company, and that their relationship also ended at that time. What Elizabeth says on the show about how the romantic piece of their relationship died when they started working together is almost verbatim what the real Elizabeth said in her deposition. It's also true that she moved out of their shared house at this time. If all this happened when Sunny was fired, if they stopped speaking to each other, they ended their relationship, and she moved out, then the breakup was probably acrimonious, so it makes sense why the show's producers portrayed it that way. But we can never know what their private conversations were at about this time. The real Elizabeth Holmes also said later that she had once seen Sunny as the best business person that she knew, but she had later realized that Sunny just wasn't the person she had thought he was. This might have inspired why the showrunners had her call him a mediocre software engineer, and how the show had her bring up that she was only 18 when she met him. Her bringing up her age might also have been inspired by how she would eventually try to use a Svengali defense in her trial. Finally, we come to the part about Elizabeth's behavior in Theranos' final months. In my opinion, the show really captured this well. In real life, in Theranos' final months, Elizabeth Holmes' behavior was just plain bizarre. Employees and board members said she just kept acting happy and chipper as though nothing was wrong, even though everything was falling apart around her. Every day, people were getting laid off or resigning. Employees were getting subpoenaed to testify in all the lawsuits and investigations against Theranos. Theranos was being investigated by the SEC. They were being sued by Walgreens and other investors. The company had been forced to move out of their swanky headquarters because they could no longer afford to stay there, and they had to move into a space that used to be one of their off-site labs, which employees described as basically a shitty place. Yet Holmes continued to act chipper as if everything was fine. At one point, Theranos managed to secure a $100 million loan, using the company's intellectual property as collateral. Holmes called an all-hands meeting for the remaining employees, looking extremely excited, as if the loan meant that the company was going to be saved and they would be able to turn everything around. Holmes expected that this all-hands meeting would be like the upbeat meetings she and Sunny used to have, where employees would break out into raucous chants and cheers. But this time, she was met with complete silence, a really, really uncomfortable silence. She just didn't seem to understand that employees had lost all morale. In 2017, about a year before the company folded, Elizabeth really did go out and buy a dog, a husky she named Balto. After learning that huskies had some wolf heritage, Elizabeth bizarrely began to tell people that her dog was actually a wolf. Balto was named after a famous sled dog who, in 1925, had led a team of huskies on a 600-mile trek across Alaska to bring medicine for a diphtheria outbreak. The dog was supposed to represent Theranos' perseverance, and she started taking the dog everywhere with her and letting him roam free around the office, even though people warned that it was not a safe thing to do in a lab, and even though the dog reportedly wasn't house trained or potty trained or whatever, and was reportedly pooping and peeing all over the place. Elizabeth also did get a new boyfriend, Billy Evans, who was almost a decade younger than her. They posted romantic photos on Instagram and attended Burning Man together. She stopped wearing black turtlenecks and began wearing athleisure. She was basically unrecognizable to many people who knew her. In his audiobook, Tyler Schultz describes once bumping into Elizabeth at a bar and literally not recognizing her because she looked so different. She was wearing all white and had a sun hat. He only realized that it was Elizabeth because she was with her brother and he recognized him. I think the lawyer Linda is meant to represent what former Theranos employees in general were facing as the company went under. Linda mentions how Elizabeth had stopped paying her and how no one would hire her. 800 people lost their jobs when Theranos went under, and many former Theranos employees struggled to find new jobs with Theranos on their resumes. Although Elizabeth and Sunny's lawyers for their criminal trials were paid for by some kind of corporate indemnity insurance, Elizabeth had also faced some civil suits that she had been privately paying lawyers for. But in real life, all her lawyers eventually quit because she had stopped paying them. The conversation between Linda and Elizabeth in the episode also reminds me of an interview that was in the Dropout podcast from ABC, the podcast that the show is based on. The podcast had interviewed a former Theranos employee who had worked there for 5 years. The employee described running into Elizabeth Holmes while he was out somewhere with his wife. He hardly recognized Elizabeth with her new look and was surprised when she came over and introduced him to her fiancé, Billy Evans. She told this employee that she missed spending time with him and asked him if he wanted to get together sometime. The employee was stunned. He could barely speak, and he just paid his bill and left. He said his wife told him that he had literally been shaking the entire time Elizabeth was speaking to him. He said he just couldn't believe how Elizabeth Holmes was acting all friendly as if nothing had happened when he had lost his job and he had been traumatized by the entire scandal. In the episode, Elizabeth seems to just be in denial about the harm she caused, saying that what happened was a business failure, not a fraud. The whole failure isn't fraud argument was actually the crux of both Elizabeth and Sunny's defenses in their criminal trials. In episode 1 of the show, there had been one scene where Elizabeth's mother had basically told her to suppress her feelings about a sexual assault. The scene is entirely fictional, but I had always wondered why the producers included it. In this episode, things come full circle when Elizabeth reminds her mother about that episode, which had happened in her freshman year at Stanford. She asked her mother if choosing to forget something was the same as lying. The showrunner's interpretation of Elizabeth's odd behavior after the scandal broke appears to be that she suppressed acknowledgement of her wrongdoings and how much harm she had caused, the same way she had suppressed memories about her assault. The series ends with Elizabeth letting out agonizing primal wails as she waits for an Uber, as if for a second she finally cracks. But then she quickly regains her composure as a new person with a new life. That brings us to the end of our recap of the final episode of The Dropout. It's been an amazing series, and thank you for following along with this channel. The channel will make a few more Theranos videos, including a final review, and there's an Adam McKay movie starring Jennifer Lawrence that's going to be produced by Apple. I'm not sure when that's coming out, but I'll definitely review it when it does. And I will also now start reviewing something other than Theranos. So I hope you decide to subscribe and stick around. For now, however, thank you for watching Scandalcast.